hooked by flashing lights. But they had no idea who they pulled over. On a quiet evening in Charlotte, North Carolina, 49-year-old Malcolm Evans, a composed and respected community figure, was simply driving home looking forward to his wife's famous pot roast. He had just wrapped up a long day filled with productive meetings with local leaders, another step in his new role of reshaping the local police force from within. But as his black sedan rolled down Sycamore Avenue, red and blue lights suddenly pierced the night behind him. Malcolm checked his speed well under the limit and knew he'd broken no law. Still, he calmly pulled over, knowing all too well how quickly things could go wrong for a black man in America, even one who wore a badge of authority himself. Two officers approached. Officer Barnes, aggressive and sharp-tongued, and Officer Miller, his silent but watchful partner. Their flashlights beamed into Malcolm's car like spotlights in an interrogation room. Despite Malcolm's calm demeanor and full cooperation, their tone was hostile, accusing him of swerving and driving erratically. "I wasn't swerving, sir," Malcolm replied firmly. "My dashcam can confirm that, but that only made things worse. Without cause, they demanded he step out of the car, yanked him out, and cuffed him on the side of the road." Malcolm didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. But in his mind, he was already preparing for what came next. They didn't know who he was, but they were about to find out. The ride to the precinct was long not in distance, but in the weight of what it represented. Malcolm Evans sat silently in the back seat of the patrol car, his wrists aching from the handcuffs that dug into his skin. Outside the window, the familiar streets of his new city blurred past, stripped of their warmth by the flashing lights above. Up front, Officers Barnes and Miller joked and speculated about what kind of trouble Malcolm might have been in. Another late-night runner, Barnes said, with a scoff, glancing at Malcolm in the rearview mirror. "Bet he's got a record a mile long." Miller chuckled. "These guys always do." Malcolm said nothing. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he knew this wasn't the time. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than argument, especially when people were determined not to listen. Inside, though, a storm raged. He had devoted his career to protecting communities, to building bridges between law enforcement and the people they served. And now, barely 3 weeks into his tenure as the city's newly appointed police chief, he was being profiled and arrested without cause by 2 of his own officers. The irony wasn't lost on him. When they arrived at the precinct, Malcolm was marched through the doors in handcuffs past officers who barely gave him a second glance. He was led to a holding cell where the metal door clanged shut behind him, its sound final and cold. He sat on the bench, back straight, eyes steady. This wasn't fear, it was calculation. The wheels were already turning. He wasn't just thinking about clearing his name. He was thinking about the department, the culture, the system that had allowed this to happen. And he was thinking about how to tear it down piece by piece if he had to. Outside the cell, Barnes and Miller leaned casually against the booking desk, laughing among themselves. "Didn't even fight back," Barnes said, shaking his head. "Thought he was too good to step out of the car. These types always do." Miller glanced at the screen displaying Malcolm's driver's license and registration. "Clean. Not even a parking ticket," he said with mild surprise. "Doesn't matter," Barnes replied. "We'll find something. They always slip up somewhere." But Malcolm heard every word. He sat in the dim cell, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly overhead. His hands folded, his mind focused. He had no intention of letting this slide, not just for himself, but for the message it would send to every citizen watching. That even those who wear the badge can be on the receiving end of injustice. That no one is immune when bias goes unchecked. The hours dragged. Officers came and went, but none of them recognized him. He was new, and Barnes and Miller clearly hadn't bothered checking his employment status. Perhaps they didn't even care. It wasn't until early morning when Lieutenant Harper, a sharp-eyed senior officer, reviewed the arrest report and took a closer look at the dashcam footage that something finally shifted. She frowned. "Get those two in my office," she told the sergeant, then turned toward Malcolm's cell. As she approached, the realization hit her. Her eyes widened slightly. She stopped just short of the bars. "Sir?" she said cautiously, her tone professional but shaken. "I need to speak with you." And Malcolm stood, not with anger, but with purpose, because now the truth was coming to light, and the real reckoning was about to begin. The silence in the holding cell broke when Lieutenant Harper returned, this time holding a folder and a grim expression. "Mr. Evans," she said with crisp professionalism. "Unlocking the door herself, we've reviewed the dashcam footage, and I've personally spoken with Officers Barnes and Miller." Malcolm stood calm and composed, but there was steel in his posture. "This never should have happened," she added. "I'm releasing you immediately, and I'd like to speak with you privately in my office." Minutes later, Malcolm sat across from Harper in a bare-walled room, the blinds drawn, and a pot of lukewarm coffee untouched between them. She clasped her hands tightly, wrestling with the tension of the moment. "I don't believe they knew who you were," she said carefully. "But that doesn't excuse anything. They escalated a peaceful traffic stop, used force, and failed to follow protocol." The footage makes that very clear. Malcolm gave a slow nod. "I appreciate your honesty, Lieutenant. And you're right, they didn't know who I was. But that's exactly the problem. It shouldn't matter." Harper exhaled. "What happens next?" "You'll be addressing the department this afternoon," Malcolm replied. "There will be consequences, but this isn't just about discipline. It's about reform." He left the precinct, not with a sense of personal victory, but with a deepened resolve. He wasn't just going to let this slide under the rug. He would use it publicly, transparently, as an example of the work that still needed to be done. Back at police headquarters, his assistant Rachel blinked in surprise as he walked in early, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. "Chief Evans, you're early. Rough night," he replied simply. "Please book the main conference room for this afternoon. Mandatory attendance." By noon, the briefing room buzzed with low conversations as officers filed in, curious and slightly apprehensive. Word had traveled fast. Some already knew something had happened, but not the full scope. When Malcolm entered the room, fell into a heavy hush. He walked to the front, stood behind the podium, and scanned the crowd. Barnes and Miller sat near the back, their expressions unreadable, though the stiffness in their shoulders betrayed their unease. "I want to be clear," Malcolm began, his voice low and deliberate. "Last night I was pulled over. I complied with every instruction. I remained calm, and yet I was handcuffed, arrested without cause, and placed in a holding cell by two of our own officers." The room froze. A ripple of shock moved through the ranks. "I didn't identify myself right away," he continued, "because I wanted to see how far it would go, and it went too far." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This department has a problem not just with policies, but with culture, and it ends now." Murmurs erupted, some shifting in their seats uncomfortably. Malcolm raised a hand, silencing them. "There will be accountability. Officers Barnes and Miller have been placed on administrative leave pending internal review. But this is bigger than two officers. It's about every moment when bias overrides judgment. Every time power is abused. Every time dignity is denied because of the way someone looks." He stepped away from the podium, eyes still locked on the crowd. "You didn't just arrest a man last night," he said firmly. "You arrested your chief. And if it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone." The message rang clear. This wasn't about punishment, it was about reckoning. The shift had begun, and Malcolm Evans was making sure it wouldn't stop with him. As the conference room emptied that afternoon, the impact of Chief Evans' words still echoed in the halls of the precinct. Conversations that were once casual turned hushed and contemplative. Officers who had shrugged off similar situations before were now forced to confront the reality that injustice had breached the very leadership of their department. Yet Malcolm knew that speeches alone wouldn't create lasting change. If he wanted to fix the culture, he had to act swiftly and thoroughly. Later that day, Malcolm convened a meeting with his senior leadership team, including internal affairs HR and community relations officers. He stood at the head of a long oval table, charts and policies spread out before him. "We're not going to bandage this," he began. "We're going to rebuild trust from the ground up. The first move, mandatory bias and de-escalation training for every officer. No exceptions, no excuses." Malcolm personally reached out to experts in the field, insisting on a hands-on program that included real-world scenarios, not just lectures. "We can't ask our officers to serve a community they don't understand," he told the trainers. "Empathy isn't optional anymore." Next came transparency. Malcolm implemented an anonymous misconduct reporting system, allowing officers, staff, and even civilians to report inappropriate behavior without fear of retaliation. "Accountability only works when people feel safe to speak up," he told the department. "That includes our own." But it wasn't just the inside that needed attention, it was the relationship with the public. Malcolm organized a series of town hall meetings, inviting residents to share their experiences, voice their concerns, and propose solutions. At the first session held at a local community center, the auditorium was packed with residents, activists, and members of the press. The tension was palpable. "I'm not here to defend what happened," Malcolm began honestly. "I'm here because I lived it. I'm here because I want to change it." The crowd was skeptical at first. Years of promises without follow-through had hardened their expectations. But as Malcolm detailed the changes underway and answered tough questions without flinching, their skepticism began to soften. One woman stood and spoke through tears. "It's not just what happened to you, Chief. It's what's happened to so many of us for so long. We need to know this isn't just a PR move." Malcolm nodded solemnly. "You'll know it's real not by what I say tonight, but by what you see 6 months from now." That night, as Malcolm returned home and finally sat down with a reheated plate of his wife's pot roast, the exhaustion hit him all at once. He looked across the table at his wife Renee, who studied him quietly. "You okay?" she asked softly. He gave a tired smile. "No, but I'm working on it." She reached across the table and held his hand. "Then so are we." The next morning, headlines blared, "Police Chief wrongfully arrested by own officers Sparks, sweeping reform." The dashcam footage had gone viral. Commentators debated the implications. Protesters gathered demanding deeper accountability across departments nationwide. For once, the community wasn't just witnessing outrage, they were witnessing transformation. And at the center of it all stood Malcolm Evans. Not as a man seeking revenge, but as a leader determined to make his own department and the system it represented better than it had ever been before. The real test wasn't over, but now it had truly begun. In the weeks that followed, Chief Malcolm Evans's reforms began to take root, and with them, so did resistance. Not everyone in the department welcomed the changes. Whispers circulated in locker rooms and break rooms. A few senior officers complained that the chief's policies were overcorrections and that his own experience had made him too emotional to lead objectively. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He had anticipated the backlash. Real change, he told his leadership team, always disrupts comfort zones. To ensure reforms weren't just cosmetic, Malcolm established an independent oversight committee made up of civilian leaders, retired judges, faith leaders, and even young community organizers. Their task: review departmental procedures, investigate complaints, and publish quarterly transparency reports. Some officers grumbled about outsiders being let into police business, but Malcolm stood firm. "The people we serve deserve a seat at the table. This uniform is not a shield from accountability, it's a commitment to it." Meanwhile, the investigation into Officers Daniels and Reed intensified. Internal Affairs found clear evidence of misconduct, including radio logs and body cam footage revealing inappropriate remarks and a deliberate mishandling of the arrest. When Malcolm stood before the disciplinary board to recommend their termination, he did so not out of vengeance, but principle. If we allow this behavior to stand, we fail everyone we've sworn to protect, including good officers doing this job the right way. The board ruled in his favor. Daniels and Reed were officially dismissed from the force. Their dismissals sent a ripple through the ranks, not out of fear, but awakening. Officers who had previously been silent about injustices began coming forward, some even admitting they'd once ignored misconduct for fear of retaliation. Under Malcolm's new system, those fears were addressed head-on. Whistleblower protections were expanded. A confidential peer support network was launched. Slowly, a culture of silence began to unravel. One afternoon, during roll call, a young officer named Lisa Mendoza approached Malcolm privately. "Chief," she said nervously, adjusting her duty belt. "I want you to know, seeing how you handled everything, it made me realize I want to be part of this change. This job, it should be about service, not power." Malcolm smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then you're exactly who this department needs." Beyond the department walls, the city of Brookwood began to feel the difference. Reports of civilian complaints against officers dropped noticeably. Community events co-hosted by police and local organizations grew in attendance. Officers were no longer just enforcers. They were mentors, mediators, and collaborators. In a neighborhood once known for strained relations with law enforcement residents, began greeting patrol cars with cautious waves instead of closed blinds. The media, too, took notice. From victim to visionary. How a police chief turned injustice into reform, one headline read. Malcolm was invited to speak at conferences and policy panels, but he never let the attention distract him. "This isn't about personal redemption," he told a reporter from the Times. "It's about restoring integrity to the badge." Despite the momentum, Malcolm knew progress was fragile. Change, he understood, wasn't a finish line, it was a discipline. He reminded his officers often, "We're not just changing how we work, we're changing how we think." That takes time. It takes humility. And it takes each of us being brave enough to confront our own blind spots. Late one evening, as he walked the quiet corridors of the precinct, Malcolm paused outside the community outreach office. On the wall was a framed photo of the department's latest youth mentorship program officers, and teens sitting side by side laughing, sharing stories, building trust. That he realized was the real reward. Not press conferences, not policy briefings, but moments like this, where the future was being shaped not by fear but by respect. And in that quiet, flickering hallway light, Chief Malcolm Evans smiled. The road was still long, but they were walking it for the first time in the right direction. As the dust settled and the department settled into a new rhythm of transparency and service, Chief Malcolm Evans knew one truth more deeply than ever: real justice isn't about one big moment. It's about what happens after. He kept showing up not for applause or headlines, but for the quiet work of rebuilding trust. One policy, one patrol, one conversation at a time. He continued holding weekly town halls, where anyone, from a concerned grandmother to a skeptical teen, could voice concerns directly. He even visited high schools, speaking to students about their rights, the importance of empathy, and what true leadership looked like. Slowly, those who once saw uniforms as a threat began to see them as allies. What had started with humiliation in the back of a squad car had evolved into a legacy of reforma movement that outgrew him, fueled by people who refused to be silenced. True strength lies not in titles or authority, but in how we choose to respond to injustice. Chief Evans could have reacted with rage or retreated in bitterness. Instead, he used his experience to lead with integrity, turning pain into purpose. That's the mark of a real leader and a real human being. If this story moved you, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or your own experience with injustice. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because stories like these deserve to be heard, and change begins when we start the conversation together.